Good evening and welcome to the May 6, 2015 regular Salem City Council meeting. It will now come to order. We're going to have the invocation by Pat Morrissey. Mr. Faber isn't here this evening, so it falls upon Pat. After that, we will then have the Pledge of Allegiance. If you'd all stand, please.
Heavenly Father, we give thanks to you for this day and for every day in our lives. We ask you to protect our workers, our street workers, the fire department workers, the police workers that are out in the street every day conducting their business. We ask you to inspire those people who are in our administrative offices, who are serving your people, and the politicians who are here tonight, so that they may do the work that is beneficial to the people. We ask this in your name, Lord Jesus. Amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Here.
Mr. Cushman?
Here.
Mrs. Dickey?
Here.
Mr. Drummond?
Here.
Mr. Nestick?
Here.
Mr. Paparotis?
Here.
Mr. Whitehill?
Here.
7 members.
Right. Everyone's received a copy of the minutes of the April 21st, 2015 meeting. Are there any additions, corrections, or deletions to those minutes?
I did not receive a copy. My printer was out of ink. But I'll go along with the rest of them.
All right, they'll stand as approved. There are no petitions or remonstrances this evening. I don't believe nobody signed in to speak at this portion. No receiving of visitors. We'll move on then to report of city officials. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to encourage everyone to attend the National Day of Prayer ceremonies, which will be held at noon tomorrow at the Village Green. There will be several speakers and a proclamation given on behalf of the city. I would like to ask for an executive session concerning purchase of property, and I will field any questions which you were unable to bring to my attention since the last meeting.
All right, let's first deal with is there a motion, Mr. Whitehill, to go into executive session? Mr. Cushman. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
All right, given that the mayor's indicated that there would be no action taken on that, we won't adjourn at this time. We'll do as we usually do, wait till the conclusion of our regular meeting, go into executive session, come out, and then adjourn from the meeting with no action being taken. Mayor also indicated if there's any questions for him, he would take those at this time. Seeing none, thank you, Mayor. Law Director, Attorney Zellers.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no formal report, but I would be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for the Law Director? Mr.
Just-
Brown.
Brooke, you've seen the new blueprints for the community center's expansion. It shows 2 parking lots along the North Ellsworth Avenue. To my knowledge, they do not conform with the residential RS3 neighborhood. Is that legally allowed to be done? It doesn't conform.
Mr. Brown, I have seen those. I certainly don't have them with me this evening. My understanding is that at some point that project was taken before the Board of Zoning Appeals and apparently given approval at some point so that it could go forward.
Not to my knowledge. There wasn't any approval given to do that. They just waved the whole thing straight through, but not to allow that in a residential neighborhood. You can't do that. You stand in the middle of 10th Street, look up the street, all you see are yards all the way up.
Well,
No parking lots.
Attorney Zellers can look into that for you, Mr.
Would you
Brown.
please? Thank you.
And with that, also look to see if what action was taken at the Zoning Appeals Board, if there was a non-conforming use granted for the whole project. Any other questions for the Law Director? The auditor, Mrs. Brothers, indicated to me prior to the meeting that she has no report, but we'll entertain any questions if there are any from council. Seeing none. Treasurer, Dr. Conrad, any report?
Sorry, Mr. President, no report.
All right, any questions for Dr. Conrad? Seeing none. Mr. Kent, Safety Service Director.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mayor Berlin, and members of council. Just have a couple things tonight. And let all of you know that at this point, we're putting our street paving project for this year on hold until we have a final resolution of the building demolition costs. As you know, we budgeted $250,000 for that project. So far, we've spent $195,380. We have an additional $15,470 encumbered, and we also have an additional $47,391 of pre-expenses from engineering and putting up the netting and the steel bands last fall. So our costs to date are $258,240. We don't have all the invoices in yet, so we're just basically going to wait and see what we have. We have a lot of streets that, we have a list prepared. We have a lot of streets that need it, but we're going to wait and see what funds may be available. And the second thing, let all your friends and constituents know that our leaf bag pickup is completely done for this year until fall. In the last 2 days, our street crews have been out and they've picked up all 4 sections of the city. So if you see any out there, they're going to have to either have their trash hauler take them away or find another way to dispose of them. But we are plenty busy now with still finishing up potholes and getting to our summer work. So with that, I'll be able to answer any questions for you.
Mr. Drummond.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Kent, you're on hold, but I assume that unless we have a really large expense, there will be some paving done. Maybe not as much?
Again, we have the list, but we have it categorized. Right now, we still have to have Howes and Baird look at it, and then we'll see what funds are available to see what streets we can do.
The only reason I ask is because I assume we set aside $250,000 for the demolition. Now we're a little bit above that, but I assume we also had already set aside for paving outside of the $250,000. So we've used $8,240 of the paving money, so to speak, for the demolition.
Well, we also still have other major capital expenditures. You know, I'd like to look at the possibility of a new 2.5-ton dump truck, some other issues, and we've got to weigh. Do I need it? Because one of my oldest larger truck is failing and can't plow anymore, so.
Okay.
Any further questions for Mr. Kent at this time? Seeing none, thank you. Utilities, Mr. Weingart.
Mr. Chairman, members of council, honorable mayor, I would like to thank the Utilities Committee of Council for taking time this past April 28th to review the wastewater treatment plant Phase 1. And before you this evening is an ordinance to authorize the Utilities Commission to go forward and to bid Phase 1 of the Phase 1A of the Salem wastewater treatment plant. And while we don't like mandates, this is a partial part of the bid project will be because of a mandate by the state of Ohio. But it is something that is beneficial to all in the remedial work in cleaning up the effluent for the wastewater treatment plant. The project before you is a $2.2 million as it stands in our latest estimates. They will be paid for from the utilities wastewater department side of the department. And also, I would ask Mr. Brown to have another meeting to take up the extension of the sanitary sewer on Benton Road. And also, the Utilities Commission will meet Thursday, May 14th at 4 p.m. That is my report for this evening.
Any questions for Mr. Weingart? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Council Clerk, Mrs. Bricker.
No, thank you, I don't have any.
All right, that concludes the report of city officials. Move on to report of standing committees. Finance, Mr. Cushman.
Thank you, Mr. President. My committee has not met. I have no report. However, my committee members will be getting a hold of you to schedule a meeting here for some topics we need to discuss. I will give you an agenda and let you know the dates when I have that.
All right,
I do have an ordinance this evening.
that'll be number 20, that dealing with authorizing the mayor to enter into a contract with the Town Center Associates for a period of 2 years.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Streets, alleys, and sidewalks, Mr. Paparotis.
My committee did not meet, and I have no report.
Utilities, Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. President. My committee met on April 28th at 6:30 in council chambers. The meeting was called to order by myself. Both members of my committee were present. Superintendent Don Weingart had asked for a meeting to be scheduled so we could present a draft ordinance for the Salem Utilities Commission. Mr. Weingart stated the commission needed an ordinance authorizing the Salem Utilities Commission to receive bids and award contracts for the Salem wastewater treatment plant Phase 1A improvements. Mr. Weingart explained the project was part of an ongoing effort to incorporate a screening system capable of meeting or exceeding waste treatment requirements under Ohio regulations. After some discussion, the committee voted to have a proper ordinance prepared. Motion made, second, and passed 3-0. The meeting was adjourned at 6:50. I have an ordinance this evening for this.
That will be number 21.
21. Thank you.
Traffic and safety, Mr. Whitehill.
Thank you, Mr. President. My committee has not met. I have no report.
Rules and ordinances, Mrs. Dickey.
My committee met on April 22nd at 6 p.m. in council chambers. Members Clyde Brown, Richard Drummond, and myself were present. The first item discussed was ordinance 1139.04D2. At present, commercial properties are not notified of changes, but residential neighbors in residential zones are notified of changes or conditional uses. That was established first in the committee. The committee seeks to clarify the ordinance due to an issue that recently arose regarding the expansion of the Salem Community Center. The Board of Zoning Appeals determined that the zoning officer, Pat Morrissey, erred in issuing a permit to expand into newly acquired property without permission of the board. This error by Mr. Morrissey could have caused loss of affected residents' rights and potentially loss of millions of dollars in materials and contracts by the Salem Community Center. Mr. Morrissey submitted a written suggestion for clarification, as did Mr. Drummond. The committee discussed the merits of each and suggestions in detail. Mr. Dowd, a resident of Southeast Boulevard, gave his comments regarding the error and the effect on Mrs. Summers, a neighbor, and the appearance of the project at this time. A motion was made by Mr. Drummond and seconded by Mr. Brown to send the following to council after review by the law director. Conditional uses shall apply to all parcels or lands at the time of the granting of the conditional use and shall be in effect for any changes on the original parcels or lands. The Board of Zoning Appeals is to hear and decide upon applications for the enlargement or expansions of existing conditional uses specifically listed in the district regulations of this zoning ordinance. Where said enlargement or extension involves additional property or properties not included in the original conditional use, a new application needs to be submitted to the Board of Zoning Appeals, and a new hearing by the board must be held. Before authorizing the issuance or extension of the conditional use permit for such enlargement or extension to additional lands, the Board of Zoning Appeals may impose such conditions as outlined in Section 1139.01 in whole or part as the board deems necessary to carry out the intent or purpose of this zoning ordinance. The motion passed 3-0. Next on the agenda was vacating an alley. The Planning Commission approved vacating the public alley PB 3/104 bordering the Richard T. Cole properties and then to the north and south, and the Lisa Baird property to the east at the 3/28/15 meeting. Mr. Brown motioned to send the ordinance to council. Mr. Drummond seconded the motion, and it passed 3-0. Lastly, the committee discussed changing council rules regarding notification of council members for special meetings. Mrs. Dickey stated that at present, rules state that notification is to the home of the member. This is completed by police officers and takes up their valuable time, sometimes requiring multiple attempts to contact members, occasionally late at night, but this is not mandated by the Ohio Revised Code. The committee felt that with modern technology such as email, text messaging, and cell phones, it's not necessary. Mr. Drummond made a motion to amend Council Rule 121.02 to read, "Notice to council members shall be served via email to the email address of record or via telephone to the number of record. If no response is received by the member, the notice shall be served to the member's residence." Mr. Brown seconded the motion, and it passed 3-0. Mrs. Dickey asked the committee to review existing city ordinances regarding structure maintenance before the next meeting due to the events surrounding the Tantastic Building demolition and adjacent buildings. I stated that it is my goal to beef up and/or create new ordinances that require owners of structures to maintain these structures. Mr. Drummond questioned if this was necessary since the Committee of the Whole approved hiring TCA. He felt that they would take on the task. I stated that I had not received confirmation that they would be supplying these types of ordinances and that the city doesn't have time to wait another year. Lisa Cahill, resident of South Lincoln Avenue, commented on the need for minimum standards of buildings. She also stated that she feels there is a need to publish the ordinances to be discussed at council. Presently, they are read by title only, which is not informative. She suggested that the ordinance could be projected on a wall during meetings or on a monitor. I have committed to reading the rules and ordinances that come out of Rules and Ordinances committees in more detail during my committee reports, and the meeting was adjourned at 7:15 p.m. Our next meeting will be June 3rd at 6 p.m. in council chambers to review the graffiti that we tabled to see if the citizens would take on responsibility for keeping this clean, and I've noticed a lot more piling up now that it's spring. Also, we want to take a look at the standards that the Design Review Board is coming up for one of the ordinances that went to Planning Commission and had those suggestions that those be standard before we vote on those. So we're going to not vote on that ordinance tonight. Thank you.
All right, so you have ordinance number 22, which is that dealing with section 1139.04D2 of chapter 1139, which you gave in your report, correct?
Yes.
And also have ordinance number 23, which is dealing with the vacation of the alley that you talked about in your report,
Yes.
correct?
Yes. And I do have a question about this. We were handed this alley vacating by Mr. Morrissey the night of the last council meeting. I did not realize that was going to come to my committee that night. I thought that would go to streets, alleys, and sidewalks. Is that not correct?
It doesn't have to with regards to that. It can come out of your committee.
Okay.
Because
I know there will be others,
There's nothing that says that it is required to.
Okay, I just know that there are others that are going to be coming up, and I wanted to know what the proper way to handle that
Well,
would
you
be.
can always, I suppose, for those issues, if you feel that streets, alleys, and sidewalks should be involved, hold a joint committee meeting with regards to those.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and then there was also on the second and third reading of ordinances, ordinance -11 and -12. Are those going to be going forward this evening?
11 will be, 12 is the one that we want to table until we get the standards.
Okay, and you feel that you need to have that go back into committee for that, correct? Okay. And as a point of order, Attorney Zellers, with the council rule change, do we need the council to vote on that?
Council.
With it having come out of committee?
Mr. President, that is correct. In order for that to become an official rule of the council, they would have to approve that by a majority vote.
All right, with regards to that, do we need anything in the form of any type of draft with regards to that to do that officially, or can we do that based upon what took place in committee? And then have council vote on that?
I think as long as all council members have been previously provided with a copy of that recommended change, that they would be in a position to vote on that this evening to adopt it.
I take it that hasn't occurred at this
No,
point in
I
time.
had done an email to Mr. Zellers, and for some reason, the delivery failed, so we can address that at the next meeting.
Next meeting? Very good. Thank you. All right, Parks, Mr. Drummond.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Parks Committee has not met. I did have the opportunity to attend the Parks Commission meeting on April 22nd. In my second meeting with them, and it's quite an interesting experience. I just thought I'd let whoever's watching know that the Parks Commission has authorized Mr. Faber to purchase some additional boats and electric motors for the lake. So they're available now for renting, and as Mr. Faber would say, go drown a few worms. So again, anybody that's thinking of getting outdoors, there's shortly there'll be some new boats to do it. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Economic Development, Mr. Nestic.
The Economic Development Committee is not met. I do not have a report.
Committee of the Whole, Mr.
Same for the
Nestic.
Committee of the Whole.
Very good. That concludes the report of standing committees. Move on then to second and third reading of ordinances and resolutions. Mrs. Dickey.
Mr. President, I would ask that the council waive statutory rules so that ordinance 11 can be read for its second and third reading tonight.
Do I have a second on that? Mr. Cushman? Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes?
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
All right, statutory rules are suspended. Mrs. Dickey.
Mr. President, I would ask that the clerk read ordinance 11 for passage tonight.
And Madam Clerk, would you please read ordinance number 11 by title only for its second and third reading this evening?
Being an
Is there no emergency clause on that?
No.
All right, very good. Thank you.
Being an ordinance amending section 1147.01A of chapter 1147 of Title III of Part 11 of the codified ordinances of the city of Salem regarding permits and fees.
All right, is there any discussion as to ordinance number 11? Seeing none, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll on ordinance number 11 for passage this evening?
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes?
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
All right, that passes then with 7 yeas. As we indicated earlier, ordinance 12 is tabled at this time to go back to committee so that they can get standards set with regards to that. We move on then to introduction of ordinances and resolutions. Mr. Cushman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to suspend council rules and ordinance number 20 can be considered tonight.
Is there a second on that? Mr. Brown. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman.
Mr. President, I move that the clerk read ordinance 20 by title only for its first reading.
All right, Madam Clerk, would you please read ordinance number 20 by title only for its first reading?
Being an ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into contract with Town Center Associates for services associated with the Salem Historic Downtown District for up to a 2-year period.
Mr. Brown.
Yes, thank you. Gotta find my paperwork here, excuse me. I'd like to move to, this is already getting out of committee, this ordinance number 21. I move to suspend statutory rules, so ordinance number 21 can give in all 3 readings for passage this evening with the emergency clause.
Is there, Mr. Drummond?
Well, I think we...
Did I get in there somewhere I
Aren't
shouldn't?
we talking about ordinance 20? Because Mr. Brown is talking about suspending rules for ordinance 21.
We've had 20
This is
already.
the first reading.
So is this the first
It's on the first
reading
reading.
only?
Oh, that's just the,
This
oh,
is
okay, I'm
first
sorry,
reading.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Is there a second then on the suspension of the statutory rules? Mr. Whitehill. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestic?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
7 yeas.
All right, that passes. Statutory rules are suspended. Mr. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to have ordinance number 21 given all three readings for passage this evening with the emergency clause.
Is there any discussion?
I'm sorry, point of order, maybe I missed it. Was there a second on the suspension of statutory rules?
Yes, there was. Mr. Whitehouse.
Okay, thank you.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll on ordinance number 21 for passage this evening with emergency clause?
Being an ordinance authorizing the superintendent of utilities to receive bids and award contracts for the Salem wastewater treatment plant, Phase 1 improvements 2015, and declaring an emergency.
If you would call the roll then, please.
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
7 yeas.
Mrs. Dickey.
I would like to ask that council suspend statutory rules for ordinance 22, that it can be read for all three tonight for passage.
Is there a second on that? Mr. Drummond? Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey.
Mr. President, I would ask that the council clerk read ordinance 22 by title only for passage tonight.
Right. The clerk would please read ordinance number 22 by title only for its first, second, and third readings this evening.
Being an ordinance amending section 1139.04 D2 of chapter 1139 of Title III of Part 11 of the codified ordinances of the city of Salem regarding permits and fees.
Any discussion? Seeing none, Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll on ordinance number 22 for passage this evening?
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Drummond?
Yes.
Mr. Cushman?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Nestick?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
7 yeas.
Passes with 7 yeas. Mrs. Dickey.
I would like to ask that ordinance 23 be read for its first reading tonight by title only.
Right. Madam Clerk, would you please read ordinance number 23 for its first reading this evening by title only?
Being an ordinance vacating a portion of a 15-foot wide alley known as Cole Alley in the city of Salem.
Right, very good. That concludes the introductions of ordinances and resolutions. At this time, as we're going to go into executive session, we'll go ahead and deal with the pleasure of council. Before we do that, Mr. Paparotis.
I'm sorry.
Pleasure of council.
Oh, nothing today, thank you.
Mr. Cushman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have nothing this evening.
Mr. Whitehill.
Nothing this evening, Mr. President.
Mr. Brown.
I have nothing this evening, thank you.
Mr. Nestick.
I have nothing, thanks.
And Mrs. Dickey.
I would like to thank all the area merchants and all the residents who participated in all the festivities downtown last Saturday with the chocolate crawl, the art museum, the farmers market. It's nice to see people in town.
And Mr. Drummond.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think you leave the blowhards to the end, right? I would only like to say one thing. I'd like to congratulate my son and future daughter-in-law for the wedding that's going to take place on the 20th. I won't be here at the next council meeting. I'll be attending that. So my congratulations to the two of them.
Very good. I have nothing this evening. Therefore, we'll adjourn at this time into executive session. Mark, at first, if you and John could wait outside, then we'll call you in. Okay?